Roth versus traditional. It's the age-old question. Which one should you pick? We're breaking it all down. You don't want to miss it. Welcome to episode 8 of the Emerging Wealth Podcast. I'm your host, John Boyd, certified financial planner, founder, and lead wealth advisor at Modern Wealth. That's modern spelt with, you already know, no vowels, wealth. We're a fiduciary, fee-only financial planning firm located in Scottsdale, Arizona, but we serve clients all over the country. I'm so glad you're here today because we got a good one. It's the age-old question. Should you do a Roth or should you do a traditional or pre-tax retirement account? So full disclaimer here before we dive into today's episode, we're not talking about Roth IRAs or traditional IRAs, right? Because with a Roth IRA, there's going to be income phase outs, right? If you make too much, you won't be able to contribute to a Roth IRA. So for a lot of folks, that kind of squashes it, the debate of Roth versus traditional. However, if you have a Roth 401k option, for example, you could make $1 billion in W-2 income. It does not matter. You can contribute to a Roth 401k. So if you have a 401k, 403b, whatever, what I want you to do right now is log in to where you have that account. It could be at Fidelity, Schwab, Vanguard, wherever. Log in and see if you have the option to do a Roth in your employer-sponsored retirement plan. If you have the option to do a Roth, then this is where this debate comes in. And this dilemma comes in for a lot of folks is, should I do the Roth option or the traditional option? Also, another quick disclaimer before we dive in, if you're kind of wondering what a Roth or traditional is in the first place, when you make contributions to, let's say, a traditional pre-tax 401k, you are getting a tax deduction on the money that you put into that plan right now. So if you put $500 a month into your traditional 401k, you're getting a tax deduction that's going to reduce your taxable income and ultimately reduce how much tax you have to pay. Sounds really cool, right? You get to save for retirement and you get a tax deduction that helps reduce your overall taxes that you owe. But here's the catch. Uncle Sam is going to get paid regardless, right? So it's a game you need to play with Uncle Sam. You either got to pay him now or you got to pay him later. So with a traditional 401k, you are going to get a tax deduction, get the tax savings up front, but that money in there is going to grow tax deferred. So later in the future, when you take money out of that traditional 401k in this example, you are going to have to report that money as ordinary income. In other words, you're going to have to pay tax on it later. On the flip side, if you utilize, let's say, a Roth 401k, you are paying the tax now that goes into that account. It grows tax-free and comes out tax-free. And the reason why it comes out tax-free is that you've already paid that tax. Again, this is assuming that you are 59 and a half or doing a 72T election, right? Something like that, where you can take the money out without any penalties being incurred. So again, that's the trade-off here. Do you pay the taxes now or do you pay the taxes later? This is really what this dilemma boils down to. And so today we're breaking down what major considerations that you should consider, as well as playing a little game of Q&A at the end. And before we dive into those considerations, guys, if you need comprehensive help, right? If you are facing a lot more complex issues than just Roth versus traditional, reach out to us at www.modernwealth.com. We are still taking on new clients. We are just about to roll out in-house tax prep for 2024. So not only do we do in-depth tax planning, but we are working on actually getting tax preparation done in-house. Again, a lot of exciting things to come. You definitely want to be a part of it. So reach out. We'd love to chat with you about what we can do for you and your family. So let's talk about the considerations. So consideration number one, we are in a historically low tax environment. And when you look at the statistics on Americans that get surveyed about taxes, most people are going to say that, we are getting taxed way too much and that taxes have never been worse. But in reality, when you actually look at the data, right? When you look at the data here, if you're watching this online, what you are seeing is a chart of marginal tax rates in the United States. And what you are going to see is that taxes have been a lot worse, right? If we look back at the last 100+ years of taxes in the United States, we are in a historically low tax environment. To add to that, right? So we've been in this historically low tax environment for a while now, but to add to that, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act is law in the United States. And if you're wondering what that is, prior to 2018, tax brackets were higher. And then the Tax Cut and Jobs Act came along and it was a complete overhaul of our tax code. And effectively what it did was reduce taxes even further. And so the tax brackets that you see today, if you Google, what are federal tax brackets, the tax brackets that you see today are because of those changes. But prior to 2018, they were higher. So for example, if you were a couple filing a joint tax return and you made $250,000, you were in the 28% tax bracket in, call it 2017. Now, if you make $250,000, you are in the 24%. So a lot better deal for you, right? 33% tax bracket prior to this versus 24% tax bracket. Your effective overall tax rate is a lot lower now. And that's really for everyone across the board. So historically low tax environment. Taxes were reduced even further with Tax Cut and Jobs Act. But here's the thing. Here's the thing that not a lot of people realize is that when you look at ways to stimulate an economy, right? A lot of people think of like money printing and all that type of stuff. But taxes is a way that you can stimulate an economy. And so the Tax Cut and Jobs Act was really viewed as a way to stimulate the economy, right? That was the whole thesis behind it, was that the economy could be doing better. So let's supercharge the economy by providing some stimulus in the form of tax relief to the American consumer and taxpayer. Because it's stimulus, it's not meant to be permanent. So the Tax Cut and Jobs Act is set to expire at the end of 2025. So starting in 2026, the tax brackets that we are seeing now are reverting to the old higher tax brackets starting in 2026. To add to that, right? This law is expiring, so taxes are slated to go higher. But on top of that, we have budget deficit issues in the United States. We have a Social Security funding problem. We have a large wealth gap in this country, right? There is a litany of issues that would suggest that the United States needs to create more revenue in some way to address these issues. And so taxes are the number one way to do that. So all signs point to taxes going higher into the future. And the reason why I bring all this up is that when you are making this consideration on whether to do a Roth or traditional, while no one has a crystal ball, the signs point to taxes being higher in the future. And if they are indeed higher in the future, maybe it makes sense just to pay the tax now versus later when taxes could potentially be much higher. So we talked a little bit about where taxes are heading as a country, but where are your personal taxes headed, right? So that's consideration number two. Think about your current situation. Maybe you are doing well financially, but your spouse, it has just turned up their income potential, and now your income is going to be much higher the next couple of years, right? You need to sit down and think about where your personal taxes are headed. Because if your personal taxes, let's say, are heading upwards, right? and you are going to be in a very high tax bracket in the future, well, maybe it makes sense to do a Roth versus do a traditional and save utilizing a traditional 401k, 403b, whatever, for when you have the need for those tax deductions in the future. On the flip side, maybe your taxes are actually heading lower in the future. Maybe it makes sense to take advantage of the pre-tax 401k option to get those tax deductions versus the Roth, right? So you really need to sit down and think about where your personal taxes are headed. Number 3, do you anticipate gap years? This is becoming more and more common. And so what I mean by gap years is, let's say you anticipate on taking a sabbatical, right, for 2 years and traveling the world. Well, if you anticipate doing a sabbatical for a couple of years and traveling the world, doing whatever, well, maybe it makes sense to do pre-tax deductions now. And then during your sabbatical years, focus on maybe not just Roth, because you won't have any earned income at that time, but maybe doing things like Roth conversions, things like that during those gap years, right? Take advantage of the fact that your income is going to drop temporarily. And it also doesn't need to be a full-on sabbatical. Another really common scenario that plays out is you have a couple, maybe one spouse is going to stay at home with the kids and they're going to step away from the career, but that's just temporary, right? Once the kids are grown up a little bit, they're going to go back and work and income is going to pick up. So maybe there's this gap in time where there's a dip and then it's going to go back up. The reason why that's an important consideration is that maybe, again, you tactically plan when you do Roth versus traditional. Maybe you do traditional during the higher years and then Roth during the lower years, and then go back to traditional once income picks up. So again, another major consideration that you need to factor. The other big consideration that you need to factor in is, when is your retirement? Maybe you're actually close to retirement, right? And retirement doesn't need to be 65, 60 years old, right? More and more people are pursuing retirement in their 40s, early 50s, right? So if you are not too far away from your dream retirement, whatever that is, you need to factor that into the equation, because maybe these, again, it kind of goes back to one of the earlier points about where your taxes are headed, but maybe the elevated income that you're currently facing right now, maybe it makes sense to address that with pre-tax 401k deductions to try to reduce your 401k. And then once you retire, start to do strategies to actually break up some of that income, right? Maybe it doesn't serve you a whole lot to do Roth now because your income is only elevated for so long. On the flip side of that, maybe you're 30, 40 years away from retirement. Maybe you're really, really young, or maybe you just want to work forever. And as a result, you want to have years of compounded tax-free income and assets in a Roth. So maybe you decide to do a Roth. So again, factor when your retirement is, because that is a key consideration on how you play this. Finally, and what's most important, is what is your personal preference, right? Because maybe you don't have the answers to any of these considerations, right? You don't know when you're going to retire. You don't know if there's going to be a gap year. You have no idea where your taxes are headed. You have no idea how to feel about where taxes are going in the United States, and you don't want to speculate, right? What is your personal preference? Because that's what matters most. And the reason why I say that is, let's say that you really like the fact that you get the tax deduction with traditional 401k contributions, right? You love the fact that you're getting those tax savings. Well, maybe you just stick with that, right? If it makes you happy, right, and it gives you peace of mind, maybe you stick with it. On the other hand, maybe the thought of having tax-free money in a Roth with years of compound growth, right? Maybe over time, that's going to equate to $2-3 million in a Roth that's completely tax-free for you to dip into in retirement. Maybe that is exciting to you, and you like the idea of putting money away into the Roth, and that's your personal preference. You're totally okay eating the taxes, right? So again, only you can answer what your personal preferences are, But bottom line is, it's important to functionally understand how they work, Roth versus pre-tax / traditional. And then once you know how they work, and once you know, hey, you know what, I do like the fact that I get the tax deduction, or hey, I do like the fact that I'm getting this tax-free, money in a Roth, then maybe you make the decision based off, again, your personal preference. So go ahead and cue the game show music, right? So we're going to play a little game here. We're going to do some Q&A, and we're going to play a game of Roth or traditional. So I'm going to read a question, and we're going to go ahead and answer whether to do Roth or traditional. So let's go ahead and play. Question number 1. Currently, I fall into a mid-tax bracket, but it is projected that I will move into a higher tax bracket in the future. Which one should I pick, Roth or traditional? The answer: I would consider Roth in this scenario. And the reason why I would pick a Roth is that, again, taxes are lower right here, right? The tax bracket that this individual is in is lower, but they do anticipate that they're going to be in a higher tax bracket for whatever reason here, right? They're going to get a big promotion. Maybe them and their spouse are both going to get promotions, right? Whatever it is, they anticipate that their income is going to be a lot higher in the future. So if that's the case for this individual, I would consider doing the Roth, just paying the taxes now while you're kind of in just that mid-tier tax bracket. And then once you really are scraping for tax deductions when you're in that very high tax bracket in the future, then I would consider transitioning over to traditional 401k to get those tax deductions. Again, that's the beauty of Roth or traditional. It doesn't have to be one or the other forever. You can teeter-totter between which one makes sense based off your current tax circumstances. Question number 2. We are currently a dual income household, but we anticipate transitioning to a single income household in the next few years. Which one should we pick, Roth or traditional? I would consider doing a traditional 401k, 403b, whatever, in this particular circumstance. And the reason for that is, again, this is also a very, very common scenario. Couple making good money as a team, tons of cash flow coming in, but their taxes are pretty elevated right now. Maybe it makes sense to take advantage of utilizing a traditional 401k to get those tax deductions, right? Money that goes into the traditional gets those tax deductions. And when you get those tax deductions, you'll have to pay taxes later, but hey, your income is pretty high right now. You really need those tax deductions. And then once you transition to that single income household in the next few years, again, this is assuming that your tax bracket is going to be lower when that happens. When that transition happens, then go ahead and change to a Roth. And the reason why is that, again, with a Roth, you're paying the taxes up front. And because presumably these individuals will be in a lower tax bracket when they're a single income household, it would make sense to potentially do a Roth. Question number 3, and this is a fun one. I expect to remain consistently in the top federal tax bracket. Which one should I pick, Roth or traditional? So the answer here might surprise you a little bit, but I would say consider a Roth. Here's why. I'll break down the why with an example. So a client that I worked with, this was several years ago, they were an executive at a Fortune 500 company. They were number 2, number 3 in charge. Their W-2 income was well over $2 million. They made a lot of money, tons of money. You would think logically for this individual that they would utilize a traditional 401k because they're desperate for tax deductions, right? We ended up doing a Roth. And the reason was this. Number 1, when I did the financial plan for this individual and we modeled out their future balance sheet, cash flow, etc., based off their assets, rental properties, right? Everything that this individual had, just the sheer dividends that their net worth was producing, right? The amount of liquid assets they had, the amount of just dividends and interest that those type of assets were producing was inevitably driving them into a very high tax bracket. That's how much they had. It made more sense just to go ahead and bite the bullet now and just do a Roth so that in the future, we didn't have to worry about paying taxes out of that bucket. Again, kind of a controversial move to some, but again, this individual was anticipating on being in the top federal tax bracket forever. And sure enough, the data showed that this was likely going to be the case. And on top of that, when we ran the numbers, Roth versus traditionals, the numbers looked a lot better for them. They had more tax savings over the long run because of that. And again, this also boils back to the fact that taxes, right? We know the Tax Cut and Jobs Act is expiring at the end of 2025. Tax brackets are going higher, right? So maybe just biting the bullet now versus later makes a lot of sense. The other big consideration, this is a highly underrated strategy for a lot of folks, particularly very high income individuals and high net worth individuals, is that this particular person had an estate tax issue, right? They were worth a lot. They were piling up a lot of assets that they were inevitably going to face estate taxes on not just the federal level, but they lived in a state that also has an estate tax. So they were facing it from multiple different directions. As a result, helping them reduce the size of their estate was beneficial from an estate tax standpoint. Because remember, when you put money into a traditional 401k, 403b, etc., it's going to look bigger up front because you didn't pay the tax out of it. But inevitably, as it keeps growing, you have a big tax bomb waiting for you because you have effectively all this unpaid tax liability there. And so on paper, when you're dealing with something like an estate tax issue that is going to tax you based off the size of your estate, that makes things look a lot worse. So just paying the taxes up front, although the money going into the retirement account might be smaller because you paid taxes in theory on it, it does help significantly with estate tax issues. And on top of that, there's no taxes that need to come out of the retirement account, right? There's no taxes. You don't have to worry about it because you've already paid the tax. Even if you have to take money out to cover estate tax, whatever it is, you have already paid the taxes because you've put money into that Roth 401k. So kind of a answer that many weren't expecting, but I would say consider it. Doesn't mean that it's always going to make sense for somebody in the top federal tax bracket to do a Roth, but I would say definitely consider it and forecast where your balance sheet and income is going in the future. Final question. With the possibility of being in a lower tax bracket during retirement, should I contribute to a Roth or traditional to minimize my overall tax burden? I would say here, assuming that this truly is the case, right? Assuming that you actually are going to be in a lower tax bracket in retirement, then of course, considering a traditional now over a Roth and getting the tax deductions associated makes sense. Because in theory, when you're in a lower tax bracket in retirement, you can dip into that 401k that has that unpaid tax liability effectively and pay it then when you're in a lower tax bracket. But here's why I want you to tread cautiously here. The reason why I want you to tread cautiously is the fact that a lot of folks don't consider things like RMDs, required minimum distributions, that force you to take money out of your 401k later in retirement. And that could inevitably drive up your tax bracket without even realizing it. Later in the future, if you've accumulated a lot of assets and you have maybe rental income, you have dividends coming off, maybe this is inevitably starting to drive up your tax bracket a little bit. So, and on top of that, what we already discussed, we don't know where taxes are going in the future, right? They could be significantly higher in 20 years. So with all of that, it's a risk, right? Especially if it's further out. If it's way further out, it's a risk assuming that you are going to be in a lower tax bracket, because I can tell you firsthand from experience working with retirees, a lot of them anticipated on being in a lower tax bracket and are surprised that they're not. And I think one of the biggest regrets that a lot of people have is, hey, I wish I did Roth, because, you know, this whole myth that I was going to be in a super low tax bracket in retirement is just not coming to fruition. Again, not the case with everybody. Not the case with everybody, right? I've worked with folks who are just a few years away from retirement. We do pre-tax 401k now, and then since they're retiring in a couple years, right, there's less speculation. We go ahead and we'll just draw off of those pre-tax assets then, right? But when we're talking 15, 20 years way out into the future, it's a lot more speculation. And again, it goes back to that question of, what is your personal preference? The bottom line, guys, Roth versus traditional. There's a lot of considerations. There's a lot of what if scenarios. But I think the biggest consideration that you need to factor in is, what is your personal preference? What is your personal philosophy? Would you rather just pay the tax now and hedge yourself against the risk of much higher taxes in the future, because you have no idea where your taxes are going to be? Maybe you can be more savvy, right? We talked about how projecting out your income, projecting out all of that can help you make the decision of switching back and forth between Roth and traditional, right? Tons of different ways to go about it, but I hope you have some of the consideration and knowledge now to make that decision for yourself. If you need guidance on picking which one is best, reach out to us, www.modernwealth.com. Again, modern spelled with no vowels, wealth. We can help you make that decision, as well as help with more in-depth planning on any other dilemmas that you are facing. I hope you found this helpful, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. We'll see you next time, guys.